I've been playing video games since I was a little boy. And throughout my life, there's one genre that I've always enjoyed and always loved. Games like Space Invaders, a simple yet addicting 1978 single-screen shoot-'em-up, or as we like to call them, shmup. Space Invaders would go on to define a genre that has lasted over 40 years, and some of my favorite games. So today, we're going to go through my favorite shmups of all time. So strap in and grab your blaster, and let's take out some enemies. In this Stinger Spotlight, my favorite shmups. Now, of course, I played these a little later because in 1979, I was only 6 years old. I wasn't going to the arcades back then. But when I was able to finally play at a game that hit my eye, it's called Galaxian. It was like Space Invaders on steroids. Instead of the aliens just going back and forth and shooting down at you, they also flew at you. The top of the formation or the sides of the formation, they came down trying to get you. And that was, in and of itself, even more challenging than just trying to shoot aliens upward. This also had color, and the opening had a piece of music to it, which was really cool. This game was also one of Namco's first big hits, and it spawned probably one of their biggest arcade games ever in the sequel, Galaga. But I like Galaxian for its pureness, and because this game really took Space Invaders and jumped it up an entire level, and still to this day is one of my favorites. Now, when I turned 7, I was finally able to start really playing arcade games, whether at the arcade or at the local pizza shop, and that's when I found Defender. Made in 1980 by Williams Electronics, Defender literally took the shmup genre and turned it on its side. Instead of a single screen, and instead of shooting upwards at aliens, this was a horizontal playfield that scrolled all the way across a sprawling planet. And you had multiple things that you had to do in this game. It wasn't just about shooting the enemy aliens and dodging bullets and making your way through levels. You had to protect the humanoids that were on the ground. And if an alien picked up one of the humanoids and took it to the top of the screen, it turned into a super alien. And once that happened, then things got even more difficult. This was one of my favorite games of the 80s, and one of the games that really defined for me what a shmup would become. Now, things were starting to happen on the home front too. The Atari 2600 and the Intellivision were both getting really cool games that were supposed to be arcade-style ports. One such shmup that was not really an arcade game, but built from the ground up from Activision. It's called River Raid. River Raid's a vertical scrolling shmup that pits you, a single plane, against helicopters, boats, bridges, and more, trying to make your way up through the levels. At the same time, you had to be cognizant of your fuel. See, as you flew, your fuel meter ran out because, well, you were running out of gas. So not only did you have to blast your way through enemies, but you had to refuel at all the fueling stops, which were plentiful, but made it more difficult and challenging for you to get through the game. This was a game I spent a ton of time on. Meanwhile, back in the arcades, Namco came back with another game in 1982 called Xevious. Xevious also came out on a lot of the Atari computer platforms I like to play on. Xevious is the evolution of the scrolling shooter and a little bit of an improvement on River Raid. Not yet one of the, top flight shmups, but still really cool in its own right. Xevious basically had you flying upwards, but this time in a more open playing field without borders to crash into, and with a modicum of enemies that you had to shoot down. Some of which you could shoot on the ground by also having a ground level weapon. And then, in the same year, Konami comes forward and brings yet a whole new dimension to the shoot-'em-up genre, Time Pilot. Time Pilot was so unique that I don't remember anything like it even now. Time Pilot is vertical and horizontal scrolling. You actually can go one of 16 directions, and all around you, enemies are shooting at you. It was insane. The cool thing was, instead of just going from level to level to level, this game took you through periods of time, thus the name. So, in the early stages, you were flying against prop planes and biplanes and Luftwaffe and things like that. But as you progressed, you got towards more modern planes and jets and helicopters and things like that, until you got to the year 2000 when, well, there was supposed to be UFOs and things like that. But Time Pilot is a game that I still play even to this date. It's really one of the best out there at what it does, and very unique. Now, no one said that shoot-'em-ups had to be just space-based and plane-based. In 1983, Bally Midway brought out Spy Hunter. This time, you're on the ground in a car. You're a spy, and you're hunting. Hunting what? I don't know. They never tell you who the bad guys are. But you get a car that's got machine guns on the front, and an array of weapons that you can pick up from trucks that will give you oil slicks, missiles, and smoke to get rid of tailing enemies. Spy Hunter was really cool in that it had, in the arcade, a steering wheel and a pedal, and while you're playing, the music of Peter Gunn is in the background, which of course, as everybody knows, is a great spy theme. Spy Hunter was another game that just took this genre and advanced it. Now, Capcom wanted to get into the game too, and in 1984 they brought out the first of many in their 1940 series of shmups. And these started out pretty basic. As you can see here, this is 1942, and a game I spent a lot of time playing. It was fairly easy. You were a single plane, and you did have a vertical scrolling field, but you could move your plane up and down that field, which was nice. Kind of like the same way you could with Xevious. Now, in this game, you didn't have much in the way of difficulty. It wasn't a difficult game to beat, but a lot of fun. You did also, for the first time, have upgradable weapons. So once you picked up a power-up, your guns got stronger, as you can see here. And then you just kept going and going and going until you lost all of your planes. And then you had to put in another quarter and play it again, Sam. Remember how I said that shmups don't have to be planes? Well, they don't have to be cars either. In 1985, in my heyday of going to the arcade, I came across a game that probably took more quarters from me than I could remember. Commando. Oh, Rambo, right? This was the story of a single gunslinging commando up against the hordes of the enemy. You just could not survive, or could you? Guns blazing, you blasted through many levels of enemies on bikes, grenades throwing at you, planes coming at you. It was insane. But in 1986, SNK came in and said, well, we could do one better. And they came out with Ikari Warriors. Ikari Warriors was, to me, Commando on steroids. This really actually did look like Rambo, so I was real hyped up for it. But here's the difference, too. In Ikari Warriors, you had a dial on the control board. In Commando, you just shot where you pointed, and that's typically how that worked. Well, with Ikari Warriors, you could strafe and you could diagonal shoot while you're moving in a different direction. And that gave you a whole new gameplay experience and a whole new level of difficulty too, because you had to know where you were shooting. But Ikari Warriors also introduced 2-player simultaneous and tanks. So you could jump into a tank and blast your way through enemy lines as long as you had enough fuel. And of course, along the way, as you killed enemies and blew things up, you could get fuel cans and things like that. And then either when you run out of fuel, or if you get damaged enough, you're going to have to get out of the tank and go back on foot. Alright, by 1987, Capcom came back with its second entry into the 1940 series, 1943, the Battle of Midway. 1943 introduced 2-player simultaneous co-op in this game, plus gave you a little bit more gameplay enhancements on the first game. So you had much better power-ups. You had many more enemies on screen. This game was much harder to play. But some of the weapon power-ups were much nicer too. So like 3-way shot, little shotgun stuff. There was also, you had a bomb that you could drop if you got into real big trouble. Enemies here, like I said, are just flying all over the place. There was not a lot of room for you to maneuver without getting hit a little bit. So the challenge level from 1942 was much greater. I spent a lot of time with this game. Meanwhile, back on consoles, I was rocking the Genesis, and man, there were a lot of great shoot-'em-ups on that console, but none more famous and more precious to me than the Thunder Force series. Starting with Thunder Force 2, this game reminded me so much of Time Pilot in that you had an overhead view, you went vertical and horizontal, it had a massive playfield, but instead of necessarily having levels, you just went to different areas. This game was hard, very hard. One of the cool things though about this game is you had multiple weapons, so you could change weapons on the fly. You could power them up, and then depending on the situation and who you're battling and what you need to do, you can very easily change up your weaponry and do what's best for the situation in hand. This game was great. But then came Thunder Force 3. And Thunder Force 3 went back to a more traditional horizontal scrolling, and this game was a looker. So the Genesis only had 64 colors, and it didn't quite rival the Nintendo 64 when it came to a full color palette. But this thing could do some graphics. And a game like Thunder Force 3, where you took a lot of the cool things from Thunder Force 2, like the multiple weapons, being able to change those weapons on the fly, and a lot of the different enemies that you saw in Thunder Force 2 showed up in Thunder Force 3. But it came out really nice, and in a lot of ways, a little bit better than 2 in that it's not as challenging. So you had a much better chance of getting farther in the game. But nonetheless, a fantastic one. And meanwhile, back in the arcades, Capcom was continuing their 1940 series. And in the year 1990, they brought out 1941, which was a leap back from 1942. Don't ask. But the game was better in every way. And man, I went to the arcade to play this game as much as I could. Because this game took 1942 and just made it better in every way. The ship was better. You had these little side wingmen that shot shots. You could do 3-way shot. You could do all kinds of different new weapons. It was, to me, kind of the pinnacle at the time of what Capcom was doing. Not just that, but the playfield scrolled left and right as well as up and down. It was tough. This game was hard, but it was fun. And man, I love this game. Now, by this time in my life, I was getting really back into the console gaming scene, and I had just gotten my Sega CD. And one of the pack-in games was a port of a game that was built actually for the Sharp X68000 computer called Feace. Developed by Wolf Team, this game was a horizontal shooter, and it didn't offer much difference in the way of other horizontal shooters except for your ship. So your ship actually had configurable guns that when you moved, you could configure them on the fly. So you could spread your guns out, you could bring them in close, you could make one go diagonal while the other stays parallel, and you could turn them around. It was really, really cool, but the best part about this game was its soundtrack. This was the first CD medium you saw in gaming, and man, the soundtrack was just killer. This was an unbelievable pack-in game, and one that I still play today. No questions asked. It's got 6 levels, it's got all kinds of great mechanics, and again, just a kick-ass score. But then in 1993, oh my goodness, probably the premier best game I've ever played on a console from the shmup era, called Robo Aleste. Robo Aleste is the follow-up to Musha on the Genesis. And man, if you love vertical scrollers, this is a game that if you could get and you have a Sega CD, this is a must-own for your collection. The plot is right out of a movie. It takes place in feudal Japan during Nobunaga's reign. A man who was part of Nobunaga's robot ninja army found a mech. And he took that mech and used it for, well, let's just say not good purposes. His younger brother decides to go after him and builds a mech of his own to match his brother's. And this story just takes place as the younger brother is making his way through level after level trying to stop his older brother. It is wild, but it also has an unbelievable soundtrack, and it also has that power-up of your weapons that just really makes this game incredible. You can also change your speed, which is something that I had not seen in other games before. But oh my goodness, this is one of the top shmups you'll ever play, and once again, to this date, I still put this in my Sega CD and run through it just for the sheer joy of it. You know, those of us who owned a Sega CD were waiting patiently for those games that really took advantage of the hardware, because this could do the things that the Genesis couldn't do. And one of the big things that we were all sold upon was the power of the system to do three-dimensional graphics. And we finally got one of those showpieces in Silpheed. Silpheed isn't the best shooter I've ever played, by far. But man, it was a game that I showed everybody when they came over to the house. At the time, you've never seen anything like this. Silpheed had polygon foregrounds, your ship, the enemy ships, and objects all around you, against a full motion video background. And it was a stunner to look at. Again, not the greatest playing game. It's not my favorite game either of any of the shmups that I play. But man, the experience. And it had a great soundtrack too. And it had full motion video cutscenes that were polygon based. It had voice. It had a lot going for it at the time. And again, you didn't see anything like this outside of the arcades. Silpheed still stands as a good shmup. Not a great one, but what a showpiece for the Sega CD hardware. A few years later, I was able to get my hands on a Neo-Geo used, and man, what an experience. The Neo-Geo was an arcade system that came home quite literally. The cartridges had the arcade boards inside of them, and they cost anywhere from $200 to $300 depending on what you got. So to get a used Neo-Geo was insanely lucky for me. And one of the games that I had to have was Ghost Pilots. Now, Ghost Pilots was more or less a clone of the 1940 series from Capcom. No doubt. Down to your power-ups, down to the ships, down to the look. But it was great to play and a lot of fun. And I enjoyed Ghost Pilots for what it was. It was also very difficult. It was a bullet hell game of epic proportions. So much so that I don't believe that I've ever beaten it. And that takes a lot. There were a lot of good shmups on the Neo-Geo, but the other one that was one of my favorites was Viewpoint.
1, 2, 3, 4, hit!
Viewpoint took an isometric scrolling angle, much like you saw in Sega's old game Zaxxon. Now, you didn't go up and down, but you went left to right, and all of the enemies were made of polygons and sprites that moved around like polygons, and it was a really futuristic look and feel. Not very different in that the mechanics were much different than other shmups, but unique from a standpoint of you didn't have multiple weapons, but you did have two wingmen that could shoot, you did have bombs, and you could charge your weapon and fire a big shot at somebody. It was a lot of fun to play. It was also very difficult, and I will say it had one of the most kick-ass soundtracks on the Neo-Geo. And I was actually able to record that down to MP3 so that I could put it on my computer or play it while I'm driving in the car. That's how good the music was. This was a solid game from pre-Sega Sammy. In the mid-90s, I had a Sega Saturn. Arguably one of the more underrated consoles out there. And man, did it have some great shoot-em-ups. So I'm going to start with one from Taito from 1995, Galactic Attack. A very generic sounding name, right? But a very good shooter. As always, you're in a ship, you're shooting enemies, and everybody around you is trying to kill you. Borrowing from one of the earlier games we talked about, Xevious, in Galactic Attack you could shoot air and ground targets. And in fact, some ground targets could even manipulate the playfield. It was a fun game, and kept you on your toes. A good solid entry by Taito. Taito was also responsible for bringing Dairus Gaiden to the Saturn, as well as the PlayStation and Windows. An arcade port, this is another horizontal scrolling shooter game, and you control a starship called the Silverhawk. You're up against the Belsar Empire, which, as you can see, are a bunch of fish. Anyway, so you have 27 stages, and you have to make it through those and survive. And, of course, take out the Belsar Empire. Each level has a boss that basically has a weak spot, a head or a mouth that you have to shoot. Now, much like other shmups, you have weapon power-ups, and like most games, you pick up emblems and you can get stronger weaponry as well as shields. This, to me, was probably one of the more fun games that I've had on the Saturn. I really enjoyed Dairus Gaiden, and if you have a chance to pick this up, you should. You can still get this game for under $100. Perhaps the crown jewel of my collection, Radiant Silvergun from Treasure. An arcade shooter that came home to the Saturn and has later been released for the Xbox 360. It's a vertical shooter, and you've got 3 primary weapons. You have homing projectiles, a spread gun, a forward firing shot, but the most unique weapon that you have is a sword. And you can use that sword to damage enemies, but you can also hold the sword out in front of your ship to collect these special bullets and power your ship up for a really special sword attack. The other unique thing about Radiant Silvergun is that all the enemies have one of 3 colors, red, blue, or yellow. Destroying enemies of the same color gets you scoring bonuses. So you can string together some combos, which is unique to the game. I think of all the games that I own, Radiant Silvergun might be the best in my collection. And for good reason. Now, a sequel came out, Ikari, which I didn't think was as good. There was something about Silvergun that just hits me, and I really enjoy the game so much. Well, there you go. Some of my favorite shoot-em-ups of all time. Ranging back from when I was just a little boy till I just got into arcade games, all the way through my console years. And I'll tell you, along the way, as you can see, I've come across some incredible shmups. Games that I still play to this day. And games that still offer some of the greatest challenges and some of the coolest enemies. And quite honestly, just solid, straightforward gameplay. So I hope you enjoyed this run with me through all of my favorite shoot-'em-ups. And of course, if you like what you see here, please hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, leave a comment down in the comment section for me. Have you played some of these games? Do you like some of these games? Is there a game that's not in my list that you like? Let me know in the comments. Also, don't forget about our friends of NLG. You can join our channel membership. It's only $1.99 a month, and you get access to some great emojis while you're watching our live streams. Your name is down there in the description. Your name is also going to show up in our outro video for our NLG show, which happens on Thursday nights at 9 p.m. And if you're a friend of NLG, there's a good chance you're watching this video before everybody else gets a chance to, as you get early access to some of our content. So once again, this is Mike Mullis for the original Next Level Gaming. This was my Stinger Spotlight on my favorite shmups. I hope you all enjoyed it, and as I always say, play on, gamers.